Hi everyone, welcome to this evening's webinar and masterclass. We're just going to give it about a minute to let everyone get into the session before we begin. Okay, we'll get started. Hi everyone again, and welcome to tonight's webinar and masterclass for the MBA at Macquarie University. Now, before we begin, I'd just like to do an acknowledgement of country. So I would like to acknowledge the traditional owners and custodians of country throughout Australia and their continuing connection to land, waters, and community. We pay our respect to them and their culture and elders past, present, and future. So my name is Luke. I'm going to be the moderator for the Q&A component of the webinar this evening. And today we are very lucky to be joined by Professor David Orsmond and Associate Professor Steve Jaynes of the Macquarie Business School. So they're each going to talk a bit about the MBA and be on standby to answer any questions you might have about the degree or about studying at Macquarie or the masterclass that will be presented later on. So the format will be as follows. I will soon pass it over to Steve, who will present and give you a general idea about the MBA at Macquarie. And then this will be followed by David, who will give you a masterclass presentation on COVID-19 and how businesses need to respond to this. So the Macquarie Business School wants to share this masterclass with future students as it is straight from the MBA and it gives you a bit of an experience about what it's like to be a student at Macquarie. So before this session concludes, we will have a Q&A segment, as I mentioned earlier. So if you have any questions throughout either of these presentations, feel free to pop it into the Q&A chat at the bottom of your screens, and we'll try and get to as many as possible. So I will now hand it over to Steve to get us started.
Thank you, Luke, and welcome again to the Macquarie MBA information session. Yes, I'm Steve Jaynes, the MBA Director, and relatively new at Macquarie. I started in January and very much enjoying working on a strong MBA and being involved in the ongoing development of our program. I'm just going to talk really for about around about 10 minutes just to give you the context of the Macquarie MBA and the purpose that we set out to achieve and working with you as you build your career, typically moving toward senior leadership positions and looking for mobility across industry as well. So just going to work through a few slides in this regard. And you're here already in an MBA information session. We hope to have you on the MBA program itself. So you're probably familiar with the purpose of an MBA, but it's also a good idea to clarify just what that is. And really it is the value of developing and building your business acumen, that is both in and across business disciplines. And that continues to be a very valuable skill set to have in industry and in business. That bigger picture view, so that strategic understanding of a business and its industry, and that's the area that I teach and consult in strategy. So you might get to, we might get to work together in due course on a strategy unit. So it's building your business acumen and your leadership capability. And I think important with the Macquarie MBA also is building your communication skills. Sometimes those skills are in short supply, and really using that business discipline knowledge to inform your decision making. So you may have great expertise in a particular field, and looking to broaden and widen your acumen across different business functions, and then use that knowledge and that experience working in our MBA to move up to a more senior leadership position. So it's sharpening your strategic thinking. Also bear in mind with the Macquarie MBA, you'll be working with, in terms of the MBA student cohort, very experienced people. Average experience is around 8 years managerial experience. So you'll be able to broaden your network, develop your connections and your contacts, and oftentimes work and career opportunities come that way. So it really is a way to accelerate your career, also build mobility across industry. And as you can see on the slide here, you may want to look at eventually, if you're not already, you might already be in a company directorship position, but building up that sort of experience or consulting work, or even in fact, drawing on our exposure to entrepreneurship and innovation to start your own business. So that, of course, increasingly is an opportunity for people in business. So in terms of developing your practice, what we offer you at the Macquarie MBA, and you're about to meet one of them, is a very experienced, practice-focused teaching staff that really do traverse from theory to practice. And that's particularly important in an MBA, is to, of course, be informing practice. So it's that traverse from concepts, models to practice, to really develop your practice. So we do offer a very industry connected program, and we're looking to build those industry connections through the curriculum. You'll also find with the Macquarie MBA, you may already know this, that we have strong flexibility in terms of the variety of learning solutions available to you across part-time. You know, if you're working full-time, you want to study part-time, block mode, weekly classes, day or evening. And we're also, this is coming out of COVID-19, we'll continue to offer greater online options to also provide that flexibility. Of course, we've ranked in the top 100 MBA business schools around the world in terms of the Financial Times Index, the Financial Times and The Economist. So you've also got that ranking and reputation. Global connections, you can see here we're not doing much at the moment, of course, with COVID-19. We're very much at home and staying in place. But we do have strong connections around the globe, and of course we'll be looking to reconnect with our partners around the world, and both for your opportunities in terms of study tours and exchange programs, and also to note that our academics have these networks and connections around the world, both in terms of their teaching, research and consulting. So that's an important dimension in the Macquarie MBA. And yeah, I think it's an important point. And I've been in this business for some years now. I was previously at Melbourne with Deakin University and at the Melbourne Business School. And similarly here at Macquarie, it's the person next to you as much as the person in front of you that's important. So your fellow students that you'll be working with, average age is 38. As I mentioned before, 7 or 8 years managerial experience. So that is a great opportunity to widen your networks, to see what's happening in other industries, to see how others with you are leveraging the MBA for career progression. So students from across 40 plus countries, broad mix of industry sectors, private, public sector, not-for-profit, so a great mix there. And of course with the Macquarie MBA, we have a strong global alumni network coming out of the MGSM history as we've moved that into the Macquarie Business School. So there is a very strong global alumni network there as well. Just briefly looking at a program of the MBA, you would probably have looked at this already, but we have different flexible entry levels, admission points. You can come in with a good managerial experience and come into our postgraduate certificate and then articulate into the diploma and the MBA itself. And also just to note what we cover in terms of you're building a business acumen across these core units: accounting, finance, economics. We've got information and decision analysis, quantitative analysis, organizational behavior, marketing, strategy, which is the field that I teach in, operations management, and then that's the foundations of management thought, which is kind of bringing philosophy to management. So that's that broad spectrum across the business functions that you'll be getting exposure to in the Macquarie MBA. And further to that, you're able to tailor your program and, if you like, curate a focus that aligns with your interests, whether it's around finance, marketing, logistics and operations. Big focus there, of course, at the moment with the challenges facing the economy today, entrepreneurship, global perspectives. So that's important as well. And also, as I mentioned before, we have the industry connections through internships. We've got the exchange program as part of our global network. And we have the living case study, which is where you're working with syndicates of students, consulting to a client, and then presenting to a client to solve a problem or harness an opportunity that a client organization has. So that's a live case study there. How you study, just briefly here, we do offer a number of block modes, and that can really help you if you're busy with your day-to-day schedule with work and or family, and you might find by organizing your study across a couple of weekends, that's optimal for you in terms of your lifestyle and commitments. So this is just to give you an idea of how that works in terms of the program of weeks, pre-reading, 3 days of lectures, then assignments in between, and then coming back to some more lectures and assignments afterwards. And that's oftentimes a really rich way that you can study your MBA. You get to know the people with you as you go through in that block mode, and it's a more immersive experience in the study. So that's 40 hours typically of contact in any unit. And then there's the pre-reading and work and assignment work in addition to that. So we do offer a supportive network, and we have Nita on this call as well, and she'll probably come in with to answer any of your questions later that get too technical for me. But we do provide this day-to-day assistance and advice. We have orientation, support workshops. We're also building our career resources and career tools. So we, right now, if you're beginning your MBA, about to, and we hope to see you in term 4 or term 1, we'll be working with you in terms of understanding your career goals and getting your career development plan sorted out, and then reviewing that at a midpoint of your MBA and then towards the end. And I think it's very important that we keep working with you in terms of both your career and your leadership development coming through the program. So that's just a very much a quick outline of our MBA at Macquarie, and I hope that's provided some overall context and a broad picture. But there's nothing better than getting a real taste of a MBA teaching experience, and for that purpose, it's my pleasure to introduce Professor David Orsmond to you. He works in our economics area and has been with Macquarie just about the same time as me, I think, David. So a fairly new recruit and doing fantastic things in terms of bringing economics and your understanding of economics and those perspectives to industry and to business. And David's going to talk about the economy of the virus, so it couldn't be any more contemporary in the impact of COVID-19 on business in terms of economic perspective. So, and no longer, that's enough from me. I'm going to cue over now to you, David. So over to you, David, for your session.
Well, thank you very much, Steve. And it's really a great pleasure to interact with all of you this evening, even on this online forum, which, by the way, we're all getting pretty familiar with these days. Steve's right that I'm also relatively new to Macquarie. In my case, I've spent the last 30 years before I came to Macquarie working on policy issues, economic policy issues. First at the Prime Minister's Department down in Canberra, and then over with the International Monetary Fund in Washington, and I lived for a while in Ukraine when I was working with the IMF, and more recently I've been with the Reserve Bank of Australia. So I teach, I'm one of the teachers anyway, of the economics unit within the MBA program here at Macquarie Uni. Now you might be thinking, well, what does economics have to do with business? Well, economics has quite a lot to say about the world of business. Things such as how do consumers go about making choices? What drives their decisions? How do firms go about ending up with the right profit maximization level of output? And how does that vary depending on the market structure that they're within. And then, of course, there's the whole backdrop of questions that all managers in business need to be thinking about. Issues like financial markets, stability of those, access to finance, how does that work? Globalization, what are the challenges and opportunities that globalization brings? And of course, there's also those big questions about business cycles. Where's the broader economy going? And how do I best respond in my company about those sorts of aspects? Well, here within the economics unit at the MBA, but generally within all of your courses at the MBA, you know, these are the sorts of questions that pop up again and again in different units as you go through your MBA. And, you know, you learn a lot of tools of how to make decisions, things you can utilize in a business world throughout not just the economic courses, but the other courses as well. But I think something that's perhaps a bit overlooked by those who haven't started an MBA yet is you also learn a lot about different ways of thinking about common problems. If you like, it's different frameworks by which you can approach an issue. And the economic framework is one of those frameworks by which you can bring to the table when you're trying to think about what's the strategy for my company over the next year or over the next 5 years, or how do we deal with this particular issue that's before us right now today? How do we respond to competition and so on? These are the sorts of things that I think are very useful to be exposed to different ways of approaching a common problem. So whether you're studying economics or whether you're studying finance or whether you're studying management or so forth, the useful thing about an MBA is that by being exposed to these differing ways of coming to a common problem, it really leads you to have an excellent way of then handling a business environment. And I think that's really why the economic unit is here as part of the core of Macquarie Uni's MBA program. But that's kind of, you know, just my sort of thoughts on those aspects. What I have been asked to contribute here is to give you a masterclass, to give you a bit of a sense about what it's like if you are a student undertaking courses here within the Macquarie University MBA. So I've picked up one of the classes that I actually teach here to the MBA students, and in particular, it's pretty contemporary. The economics of the virus, what it really means for our economy, and in particular, what does it mean for business? Now, as I mentioned, this is a 3-hour lecture that I do for students. There's a lot of breaks and talking in between. Don't get too scared about 3 hours of straight talking. But I've slimmed that 3 hours down to sort of perhaps a 15-20 minute presentation of some of the core ways of thinking through this issue. If you like, kind of, what do I mean when I say a framework for understanding? And that's what I'd like to pick up today. Now, we'll have to move through some of the material fairly quickly. And obviously in the Q&A session, I'd be very happy to pick up and elaborate on any of the points that are going through. But let me give you an indication of the sort of things that we would cover within this kind of a course. So I'll just pick up my share screen here. Okay, I hope you can see those slides that are there. So by now, everyone's very familiar with the kind of immediate impact on the economy of the coronavirus effect here within Australia. So, you know, we're looking at probably something like a 10% decline in output, an unemployment rate that rises from somewhere around about 5% up to maybe 10% or so. And that this is a very, very large shock that's happened to the Australian economy. And in fact, it's much larger than the global financial crisis. We don't yet know the exact numbers. Different forecasters come out with slightly different numbers. These are from the Reserve Bank, where I used to be working, but they're broadly indicative of the sort of thing in terms of the immediate decline and then the gradual pass back to as we try to get the economy back on track again. Well, this is information that's well known. You can read it anywhere. Everyone's familiar with that sort of thing. The real value add that comes from continuing your education and ultimately from the MBA, I mentioned before, was being able to understand frameworks for thinking about how do we put all this information into a way that we can understand it understand what the country needs to do, and understand what business needs to do. So what I want to do is to spend the next, as I said, 15 minutes or so, going through essentially 5 issues. Firstly, with the big shock down, what are the key components to understanding what's led to that shock, to that economic shock? Then on the basis of that framework, once we've worked out what the components of that big shock down is, think about what is the government's response? What's been behind their thinking about the policies that they've brought in at the central bank, as well as the folks down in Canberra and the states as well. Then think about, after that government response, what are the remaining challenges which we still really need to deal with, particularly in the near term? Move on to the 4th question. What does all this mean for business? After all, that's what the focus of all of your attention really is. And finally, I want to sort of outline a framework for thinking about the future and how we're going to well manage that future. What are the ingredients that we're going to have to do in order to make sure that we have a good future from here? Okay, so that's the agenda. 5 questions. What happened? The government's response, the remaining challenges, what it means for business, and how do we manage our future? Okay, so let's turn to the first of those. What are the components that led to that sharp 10% decline in GDP? Well, if you ask anyone in the street, obviously the first thing they'll say is, well, it's the COVID crisis. You know, it's the effect of the virus on people's health and the worries that we had about hospital resources, and that's led to the decline. And that's kind of, certainly right. That's the major trigger point. But the real reason why we got that output decline is for 3 other aspects that happened thereafter that linked in to the COVID virus effect. The first of those was the rapid shutdown in parts of the economy. Now, of course, that everyone was sent at home. We worked from home. Some of us were able to do that well. Some of us were not able to do well. Some industries were closed. Think about things like tourism, or pubs and clubs, hospitality, entertainment, and so forth. So there was a big decline in the supply of goods and services. That's what GDP is all about. So not surprisingly, it fell. But over and above that, there was also a big decline in what we call discretionary spending by households. That's the things that they don't have to spend money on today. Buying a car today, they can wait till later. Those sorts of things. And also a big decline in investment. When things are uncertain, investors are certainly not going to step up to the plate and say, now's a great time to decide to go off and buy some new machinery or build new infrastructure and so forth. And then the 4th aspect of this was there was a rapid change in the value of assets. So there was a lot of volatility in asset prices. This is particularly in March, April, and a decline in many asset prices, particularly on the stock exchange. So if you take those 4 factors together, and they were typical around the whole world, not just here in Australia, the threat to public health, in particular, whether our hospitals were going to cope, the reduction in supply as certain industries were completely closed, the additional reduction in demand for goods and services, the discretionary sort of stuff, and the volatility going on in financial markets. There was a very high level of uncertainty. Uncertainty weighed on all of these aspects and certainly weighed on the economy. And it was the sort of thing, that uncertainty, that loss of confidence, that was being reflected in those Reserve Bank graphs that I showed you before. And the problem is that when you have these high levels of uncertainty, you get a corrosive amplification effects. I don't spend now because I'm worried, and then someone doesn't get an income. That means to less employment in those areas, which means those people don't spend, which makes me more concerned about spending, and so on down, a sort of vicious circle down. So that's kind of the way to think about what happened in those months of March and April being reflected in those graphs as we saw beforehand. Okay, well, if we've now got a clear understanding of what happened, what were the factors that led to it, then we can start thinking about, well, what was the government trying to do in the response factor to that, which also came through at the same time? Well, while this coronavirus crisis is different from previous crises we've seen, you know, the last time we had a global pandemic was almost 100 years ago, in fact, over 100 years ago. Nonetheless, we're not flying blind in how do you deal with large shocks to the economy from whatever their source is. And there's a few lessons which, you know, the policymakers and academia have picked up on what you need to do to immediately start stabilizing the economy, and in particular, to build confidence amongst the population. What we've learned is that you've got to do very large upfront measures using all of your policy tools. Shock and awe is part of the policy response. In other words, you want the policy response to look like it is very large and addressing the kind of areas that people are most concerned about, income and jobs. If you want to give people the confidence that the policymakers are on top of this issue and they are doing the sorts of things that are going to be necessary in order to basically stabilize and provide some certainty in what is an otherwise very fast-moving and uncertain environment. That was a big part of the thinking, I think, that was going on behind the scenes in the government's responses as they were thinking about what to do in those announcements that came through in March and in April. Well, now, usually when you have big economic shocks, the central bank's interest rate policy is a large way that you respond to it. Big declines in interest rates is the sort of thing we saw in the global financial crisis. Well, as you know, that wasn't available to central banks around the world this time. Many of them already had very low interest rates leading into this crisis, and therefore that wasn't going to be part of the way that they provided support to the household and business sector. Instead, central banks played a very important role in providing liquidity to the banking system to make sure that the banking system was not going to have to worry about scrambling for funds as everyone tried to work out who was going to be able to pay and who was not going to be able to pay. In fact, the banking system ended up being a contributor to the stability. Instead of being a propagator of risk as it was during the global financial crisis, it ended up being an absorber of that risk, enabling households and businesses to defer payments until they're in a stronger position to be able to make those. But with the central bank not really being able to play its usual demand management role, that meant that much of the heavy lifting fell on the government's policy, in particular the government's budget policies. So the government essentially provided income support to businesses and households to replace the lack of income that was coming from the private sector itself as people pulled back their own spending and people got stood down and they were not being paid their wages from the business sector. So you know all the various programs, the direct support to companies, particularly small companies, JobKeeper, JobSeeker, the welfare payments, and all these sort of things. They were all basically doing the same thing, providing income from the budget in order to substitute the lack of income coming within what we call the circular flow of income within the private sector. Well, that has had a marked effect on many of those aspects we spoke about in understanding what happened. The government's aggressive responses as it related to getting on top of the health crisis has meant that in many areas of Australia, the health issues seem to be well contained. Victoria is obviously a question, and I'll get back to that later on. The liquidity response has helped, as I said, so that the banking sector issues have not been an additional challenge that we've had to address. And in fact, the economy is undertaking a bounce back as activities are able to reopen and people are able to start getting back to the sorts of things that they were doing beforehand, albeit still with social distancing and the containment from there. But that brings us then on to the third of these issues. What are the remaining challenges? Well, the big remaining challenges come from really three aspects. Firstly, while there's a bounce back going on, there's still much of the economy that is still being severely challenged. Now, that's particularly in certain sectors, those ones I mentioned before, tourism, entertainment, hospitality, are obviously still under serious constraint. There are far fewer migrants coming to Australia on net, so therefore the sorts of things that new migrants to the country buy, houses and retail to fill the houses with furnishing and so forth, that's obviously all under constraint as well. So while some sectors have been able to start returning back to normal, many other industries within the economy are still under serious constraint. That means we have kind of a, if you like, a 90-95% economy of where we were in 2019, just because some areas are not able to return and those that do are still under pressure and stress. On top of that, we still have a pervasive level of uncertainty. As you know, unemployment has increased dramatically. And that sort of thing makes people very wary of going off and deciding to start spending on things that are discretionary. They still go to supermarkets, buying all the things they need. They're the necessary essentials. But the discretionary spending is still under pressure. And of course, the ongoing challenge in dealing with the virus, particularly the events going on in Victoria, continue to sort of weigh on confidence overall. So this gets expressed in what is likely to be a very gradual pace of improvement in the unemployment rate. So it's jumped up, as I said, to something around about 10% overall if you take it. The numbers might be a little higher, lower at the moment, but it's going to take a while for that to be worked off because we're still going to be challenged in some industries to come back to normal, the hospitality in particular, but also, the hospitality and other industries I mentioned in particular, but also every industry is going to face some challenges. The confidence effects take a long time as well to come back. In fact, if you look in history, when we've seen these large jumps in unemployment, just focus now on the red line, this is for Australia, total employment, you can see that when unemployment's risen up to levels of around 10% or so, where it is now, it's traditionally taken a good many years before the unemployment rate has got back to the same kind of levels as it had beforehand. In fact, almost a decade or so. And you can also see from this graph a second part of the story that I want to just emphasize, that much of that burden of unemployment is particularly on younger people, those aged between 15 and 24. In fact, their unemployment rates tend to be about double the rates of the overall employment, and that's probably what's going on right now as well. And you can see that for youth, it also takes a very long time until the unemployment rate gets back to normal again. So these are the sorts of factors that are going to remain in our near-term challenge as we work our way out of this large economic shock. Okay, well, that brings me then to the fourth question that I raised and want to talk about in these few minutes. What does all this mean for business? Well, I want to just highlight four particular aspects that I think every business is going to need to be thinking about right now. Now, the responses and the degree of the challenge in each of these will vary depending on the particular industry that a business is within, and also the business itself, whether it's a big business or a small business or whatever within each industry. But broadly speaking, I think there are four things that every company is going to have to be focusing on as a way of working out how it is going to handle the economic factors that we've spoken about so far. Well, the first of those is kind of pretty obvious. There's a real risk that supply chains either have been disrupted or will continue to be disrupted as the health issues continue to go and as some companies don't actually make it through this crisis. So it's going to be really important that for essential supplies within any business function, that the central supplies are, that you're thinking very much about what is the diversity of the supply that I can get. And if it comes from global, how are you going to make sure that as different countries handle the virus in different ways, that you're not going to find that in principle, one essential item that you need isn't stuck in some country where it's having a tough time managing the virus. So coming up with a resilience in your supply chain is going to be an essential ingredient for many businesses, particularly those involved in any way in obviously manufacturing or goods production more generally. The second one is the one that I think is still being absorbed throughout the business world. There's going to be a relatively weak level of demand coming from the private sector. That's that 90 to 95% economy that I was talking about earlier. You know, households and even clients of business in general, other business clients, are going to be very wary of spending their money on basically in the same way that they were beforehand, like in 2019. That pervasive uncertainty which will hang over the economy for the next few years at best is still going to be there. And that means that within a weak demand environment, businesses can expect an even more intense level of competition than they were experiencing before. So if you ask business in 2018, 2019, how's it going? Many of them will say, look, we're just hanging in there. Everything is really competitive from overseas, from domestically and whatever. Well, we're likely to see even more of that as businesses compete against each other to get what is a smaller level of sales opportunity because of that weak demand. And that's something that I think is going to lead to that, to the next two of these 4 points that I want to raise about businesses. Firstly, if you're the one that's going to get that demand from clients or and customers more generally, you better make sure that you're providing real value to the customer. You know, value for customers is something that shifts all the time. Customers are constantly coming up with new things that they would like. But this kind of coronavirus shock has really been one where customers are now thinking a lot about, well, how do I deal with my purchases in a coronavirus world? First of all, what do I expect from companies in the ability to do e-commerce? Do I expect portals that work really well, such that I'm easily able to order things and then have them delivered in a timely manner, because that's what I want nowadays. That's what I've seen and that's what I want. How easily can I find the sorts of items that I want and know exactly the type of item that's there? What's the website of the company like? And so on and so forth. What companies will have to think very carefully, what were consumers wanting before this crisis and what are they likely to want now that is even more challenging than what we were trying to do beforehand? That means that for a lot of companies, they're going to have to think very carefully about their investment plans. Now, I don't think many companies are going to be going off and building new factories and so forth in this kind of environment, at least not for a few years. But think about what a company is going to want to be doing in the IT space and in research and development in niche markets. How do we make sure that we are providing that quality value service to customers in this increased competitive world? And that leads, of course, to the last of these 4 components, which is to think about costs. You know, one thing that's come out of the coronavirus story is that we're now much more aware, all of us, about how to use the infrastructure that's been around with the internet for actually decades now. We're all gone up the fast learning curve of Zoom and Skype, and we're all able now to manage meetings online. Well, how do companies use that increased flexibility in the way that they can use labor? How do they have meetings? How do you make sure that people understand and know the people they're dealing with on an online instead of a face-to-face input and so forth? And how do companies make sure that they're undertaking the right kind of structure of their internal processes in order to minimize costs while still preserving value to customers? As I said, for each company, these four things are going to vary, but I think all four of them are aspects that companies are going to have to be thinking about within this coronavirus and kind of world and the period immediately thereafter. So my final slide and my final question. What does all this mean about how we actually go about managing our future? You know, it's easy to be gloomy when you look around at what's happening right now and the challenges and the uncertainty and so forth. And I can understand that. But I think it's really important to remember that we can, should, and we will manage our future. That's within our own control. Obviously, we've got some challenges to address. That's very true. But, you know, we come in this country in Australia from a very successful track record, a 3-decade-long track record. You know, we are a very dynamic economy, very outward looking. We distribute income pretty well across the economy and all sorts of other attributes that we've built up over those 3 decades, which give us a great basis on which to build for the future, noting indeed the challenges that are there. What do I mean by that? Well, I've just highlighted 4 aspects here. You can probably think of more. One of them is, I think it's very important to stay open to the world. You know, we get a lot of benefits from that. Many people think about just the trade flows, and of course that's important for Australia, medium-sized open economy. But, you know, there's a lot of benefits of staying open to the rest of the world. One of those is just the flow of new ideas. We don't need to invent everything here. We can just hear about what's worked in other countries and bring it into our own economy. That's one of the benefits of staying open to new ideas, new practices, and new opportunities as they come across the rest of the world. And that's something I think we should continue to build on. Secondly, we need to sort of accelerate our pace of productivity. Productivity, output per hour, is something that ultimately underpins all of our wages. If you want higher wages growth, you're going to need higher productivity. There's been some challenges leading up to the coronavirus in productivity growth within Australia, and we need to take a careful look at the sorts of things that would accelerate our productivity and start laying the foundation for that now. I'm talking about things like how do we increase the pace of innovation within the economy, not just new ideas that we've created, but also, as I said earlier, picking up ideas that have already out there in the world more generally. How do we go about designing a good infrastructure program that's well focused on the most important needs, particularly if it's being paid from a budget where there aren't many extra resources around? And in the whole swing of other issues that people mention, whether they be tax policies or industrial relations policies or so on and so forth. These are all important ideas. The reality is we probably know more about the ingredients that go into productivity than we do about the exact recipe of how to create it. So we're probably going to have to work on all of these sorts of fronts simultaneously, which, by the way, is the sort of thing that we were doing in the 80s and 90s as well. Well, one important aspect that we're definitely going to have to work on that comes from the issues that I was talking about before is the need for training our youth. I already mentioned that the youth are going to bear a disproportionately large part of the rise in unemployment. And we need to make sure that we don't end up with what we call labor scarring. People get disillusioned because they can't get a job. You know, it's going to be a great time, as all of you are thinking right now, to get more skills, to work out how you can end up with the real value to be able to set yourself up for successful careers. Remember, you've got many decades of income earning in the future. The more skills you have today, the better those prospects are going to be. Fortunately, with this new online learning and so forth, we're going to be able to tailor a much better horses for courses, whether it's face-to-face courses, online courses, a mix of those, and so forth. That's a useful part that's going to come out of this process, maybe a silver lining. But the fundamental point stays the same. We need to think about how we can go about ensuring that the burden of this is minimized upon the youth, and training must be a big part of that. Finally, You know, it's very important to remember those long-term issues. We still have a climate change challenge. We still have an aging population. We still have lots of technology change coming through, which, you know, threatens the current practices for some workers, and we have to move workers into other practices and so on from there. Those issues are still there, and they still need to be addressed overall. They tend to be the things that take quite a while. You know, you put them in place now, you don't see the dividends for a long time, partly because some of them are indeed very long-term problems. Climate change is one. But this suggests, and this is my last comment, that there's going to be a real premium on leadership, communication with everyone, bringing a collective sense of how we will manage our future out of what is currently a very large level of uncertainty, but making sure that everyone has a voice within that as we manage what I suspect is going to actually be a pretty bright future after we get over these great challenges we face in the near term. And I'll leave my comments at that, and I think we're going to now turn directly to Luke and the Q&A session. Thank you.
Thank you for that, David. That was fantastic. I think a lot of our future students will get a lot out of that. I know I did. That was very inspiring, especially at the end there, to think through all what's happening at the moment. There is still some optimism there. And thanks again, Steve, for giving that outline of the MBA. And we've had a few questions coming in about the structure and just what it is like to study at the university. So as we move on to the Q&A section, if you do have any other questions, you can still pop them into the chat and we'll try to get to as many as possible. And just quickly before we begin, we've had a few questions about, is the recording going to be available? And it will be. It'll be sent to your emails after this presentation is completed, and it'll also be available across Macquarie social media. So let's get into it. And we had the first question here from Alphonse, who was asking about how they can obtain some leadership skills throughout the course. So I'll hand this over to you, Steve. So how can a student develop those practical leadership skills to use in their career?
So yeah, great question. We do have a number of leadership units. We've got one focused on self-development, so understanding yourself as a leader and then building on your strengths, the sort of diagnostic self-development, leadership capability building. We've got a couple of other leadership units, but I can also say we are currently designing a leadership unit focused on practice and building leadership capability to come into the core of the MBA. And we're also building an integrated leadership development program. So right through your MBA, there'll be those that focus on leadership skills, and that's about yourself, which is an important topic, of course. And perhaps where some MBAs are too discipline knowledge heavy and don't focus on you as a student, and where you're placed in this MBA world and the discipline knowledge and how you can build your practice. So we're bringing that through as a theme in terms of your leadership development. And at the same time, we're working on your providing resources and tools for your career development, both early and through your MBA journey. So I think that's really it. It's I think, you know, David, you made a couple of good points there toward the end about the importance of clarity in your leadership, your communication, and how you navigate through uncertainty and how you tell a good story as a business leader to your own people. And that also brings in strategic thinking and getting clarity. So that's a theme throughout our MBA. Great.
Thanks for that, Steve. Maybe we'll get another question for you, David, about COVID-19. And we've got a question here from Edith, who works in the supply chain sector. And they were wondering, what do you think would be the so-called bread and butter for companies doing global business to bounce back, and especially in comparison to their competitors?
Well, Eden, you've really touched on the $1 million question there, and probably for many companies it is $1 million question. If you step back a little bit, the world's becoming increasingly globalized. That's because of the economic benefits, if you like, economic benefits of specialization. So for many years now, we've had countries essentially doing the things that they're relatively good at and then trading with other countries to get the sorts of things that that country is relatively good at. That kind of process has led to such obvious benefits around the world that it's becoming deeper over time. And I suspect that's going to continue to move on. So when you're saying, how does a company go about surviving within a globalized world and being successful within a globalized world, I think it's going to be really depend on trying to work out, well, what is our value add? What are we relatively good at doing? In economics, we call it comparative advantage. And how can we build off that? Not just in terms of becoming better and better at it, because that's what we're really about, but how do we let people know that that's what we're really about as well? Which is an issue about how to use the world's communication channels so that you're extending out your reach so that people can know where to come to if they want particular products. This is especially important in the issues that I was saying, in an environment where every country is going to have less demand than it did beforehand. This is going to be a bit of a struggle for the next few years. So it's going to be especially important, picking up on a comment that Steve just said, that a company really thinks carefully about what its particular leadership and its particular things that it brings to the table for. Be very clear on those aspects, and then make sure that its clients and customers in general understand those aspects and therefore can survive. The specifics will vary a lot by the company, the industry, the country you're in, but they're the kind of focus that I think at the high level is going to be really important.
Yep, thanks. And thanks for that, Eve. Great question there. So we have another one here for you, Steve, but maybe David, you could also weigh in on this. So Madden asks about, they're considering studying an MBA, and they're just a little bit hesitant with the current uncertainty. So what would you say to a future potential student who's still tossing up whether to do the MBA?
Yeah, good question, Matt, and thanks for sharing that. Luke, I might be biased here, but now is a great time. You know, where the labour market is a little bit uncertain and there's not a lot of progress happening in the workplace, now is the time to build your human capital. And David, you made that point yourself earlier. So you're investing in yourself. As Warren Buffett said, that your best investment is in yourself, and also the partner you might choose as well. And he did well on both those situations. So really, it is a great time now, because it's about competitive advantage. So think about yourself and how you're competing against others on the labour market. And with an MBA, you're providing yourself that competitive edge. You're developing your business acumen across business disciplines. You're building on your existing experience, your work experience, your managerial experience, and you're then, bringing yourself back to the market, if you like. You may already be working at the same time, but you're building up your human capital. And then, the economy, as David has said, we'll get through this, and we'll get back to growth, and probably strong growth once, let's hope for a vaccine to come through. But that'll get us through this, and the economy will charge after this. And so now is a good time, I think, to do an MBA, especially at Macquarie. David.
Yeah, I would like to jump in on that one, actually. So I'm not going to repeat the aspects that Steve just said. It's absolutely a great time to build human capital. But I want to just bring another aspect into that as well. I actually think it's really important, and I really advise all students, that once you've finished your first degree, go out and work for a while, and then make sure you come back and do another degree. Because once you've got the benefit of experience in any entity for a while, 3-5 years, maybe a bit longer, doesn't really matter, you build up some ways of understanding the world that you didn't realize when you were doing your first degree. But when you do your second degree, an MBA or anything else that you decide to do, you really start realizing how to match the knowledge that you already had, the new experience that you've now picked up, with the new framework that you're getting in your subsequent degrees. It's a very, very powerful way of setting yourself up with a high level of human capital. And you remember, you're going to then be trading off that human capital for the next 30 years or so. Most of you are probably about 35 or so. You've got a good 30 years ahead of you or so of work. So it's a really great opportunity to be able to bring those two aspects together. It's a very different kind of way of learning than what you did in your first degree. That's what I did with my degrees. I finished up uni. I went and worked for a couple of years and so forth down in Canberra, And then I went on and did my master's and PhD degrees. And I feel that I really were able to be much more successful in my subsequent degrees because of that experience I'd already had of working. So I think for all of you, you'll find it a really exciting opportunity. I really hope you follow it up.
Mm-hmm. Some great advice there. That's really good to hear. Just in the interest of time, I think I might try and combine a few questions. And we've had a few coming through about what is required for students going into the MBA. So people are asking about whether professional experience is important for that admission process, especially if their WAM wasn't technically strong enough. Steve, what would you say to a student who is considering this?
Yes, absolutely. Your professional, your managerial experience is vital, and we take that into account. We'll look at you overall, and if we do see strong managerial experience, that is to do with looking after people, having direct reports, budget responsibilities, KPIs in your work. Now that's really valuable, and that's what you're bringing to us as well. You're bringing that into the MBA program. You're sharing that knowledge, that experience with your cohort, and you're bringing to life. You're helping to make sense of the models and the tools and the various business disciplines that we work you through in the MBA. So we will weigh that in very much so. And there is the different pathways in terms of, if you don't have that bachelor's, you can come in through the graduate certificate, as I mentioned at the beginning of the session, and work your way through there. So most certainly, this is a post-experience MBA, so we look for your managerial experience and we value that.
Mm-hmm.
Thanks, Luke.
And just another question for you, Steve, on that. People are asking about whether it is, and you can complete it part-time, and how long would that take? And maybe just reiterate the flexibility of that degree.
Yeah, absolutely. So we tailor the MBA. We provide those options for you to, if you're busy with, in terms of your work, career, family, you can study 1 unit per term. You could have a bit of a holiday at some stage. So you can work through at a pace that suits you and that fits in with your commitments. And again, we have a number of block mode options where you essentially studying a unit across a couple of weekends, with work and preparation in between, and assessment work as well. So yeah, we do offer those flexible options, so that sort of to fit around with you. And as I said earlier, we're also building the online offering, and there's great technology. We're using one now. So we use Zoom in our teaching. David's been using it to great effect in economics. I know that. I've had lots of great feedback from his students. So yeah, that again provides greater flexibility, and we're looking to harness more of that in the MBA.
Mm-hmm. Yep, that's great. Thanks, Steve. We've got maybe one final question here, and you can both weigh in on this. Davari's asking about what type of experience can a student get while studying in terms of possible ability to collaborate with industry leaders or internships. What kind of things would be available to students?
Well, I'll jump in quickly if that's okay, David. So we have a few options there. We have a living case study, and I was on the panel of judges for that presentation of our students to the Haymarket Foundation in the not-for-profit sector. So that's where you're working with your fellow students and basically consulting to a client, whether that be private or public sector. We have the internship program that we offer and run each term, and that's where you'll be positioned, placed in a business and building up experience there. And I've heard anecdotally that can then lead to work opportunities, job opportunities down the track. So we have that program running as well. And we're looking to build the industry facing aspect of the MBA as well next year, with bringing in, we have guest speakers already that you'll be interacting with, and we're going to design that more into the curriculum. So it's really a designed industry program built into our core units. So we'll be working on that front as well. I don't know, David, if you want to add to that.
No, I don't have anything further to add, Steve.
Yep, just in the interest of time, I think we'll wrap up there. Thank you again, David and Steve. That has been really great, and I'm sure all the students and future students have got a lot out of that. If you had a question and we unfortunately didn't get to it, our team will reach out to you and email you later on throughout the week. If you would like to ask any further questions, you can always book a 30-minute personal phone consultation. I put the link in the chat now, so feel free to do that, or you can call the postgraduate student team. Apart from that, have a great evening and thank you for joining us.
Thank you.